Hi, welcome back to the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Today I'd like to talk to you about a Dresden Plate quilt that I've made and talk to you a little bit about the fabrics, the pattern, and the quilting on this quilt. So grab a cup of coffee and let's get started. This quilt, I was one of the very first quilts that I made on a larger scale quilt, meaning something that was big enough to actually fit on a bed and not a lap quilt or baby quilt. So this was quite an undertaking for me. And how this progressed was that I was out shopping in Walmart, of all places, and I noticed a package of this fabric. And they were all pre-cut. I think they were, it was a package of fat quarters that had been packaged together, and it had these fabrics, everyone except this fabric with the mostly white background, but the other three were packaged together. And something about it really struck me as being very beautiful together, and blue is one of my favorite colors. So I took them home and I was trying to decide what type of pattern to use these fabrics for. And I came upon the thought of doing the Dresden Plate quilt. Now, the Dresden Plate quilt is believed to have been designed or started about 1910. And it was a derivative of the actual Dresden china that was being produced in Germany at the time, and it was very dainty designs on their plates. So then by 1920 the pattern itself had been published, and at that point it grew in popularity and also availability to a lot of people. So back to the fabric. The fabric comes from Walmart, and as you can imagine, a lot of times Walmart gets a bad rap for their fabric. But in this case, I found this to be as good as any fabric. It has held up well. There's no signs of wear. The only thing I noticed a little bit and it really goes through all the fabrics on here, is it has faded just a little bit, and I think that's from washing over time. This quilt is about 9 years old, and the white fabric here in the plate came from an actual quilt store, and I think it's fared about the same, maybe a little bit better, but pretty much it's aged about the same. The blue and white fabric came from a big box retail fabric store. So once I decided what I wanted to do with this, then I decided that I needed a pattern or template to go by. So I ordered these templates. This is for the Dresden Plate, and as you can see from the packaging, grab a hold of these, that it shows 4 different designs on the front of them. And it's from Marty Mitchell, and I think it's Heart in Hand is the name of the company. And it has the plexiglass templates. It has 3 different sizes with the rounded fans on the plate. I did not go with that because at the time I had made a lot of lap quilts and baby quilts and stuff like this, but I'd never tackled anything quite this large or this involved as far as a design goes, and I wasn't sure about my skill level in getting the rounded designs on this, so I decided not to go with that. I did go with this particular template, and with this one you cut it out. There are markings on here for a 7, a 10.5, and a 12-inch base, so you can make larger or smaller Dresden plates. And you cut these out, you fold them in half, and then you sew across the top. So you're folding it lengthwise. You sew across the top, and then when you unfold it, what it does is it creates that point in the blade. And you sew those together, you sew a circle in the middle, and you've got your Dresden Plate. And at that point you would applique it onto a base, either by machine or by hand. Now for this quilt, I did that by hand. I did the piece, I sewed the plates together with the machine. I sewed the borders on with the machine. But the quilting and the applique I did by hand. Now the quilting, I have decided on this one to do one row of stitching along each blade and then one row of echo around the whole plate. And then I mirrored that by doing an echo that is just slightly off of the ditch here, so it allows that sashing to kind of stand out. And I did that on both sides of the sashing, and I have a small design that runs down the border here. In retrospect, I wish that had been a little larger. I don't think it was quite in scale that it needed to be. And then there's a little bit of stitching right here on the corners just to kind of fill in the space. And what that has allowed this to do is crinkle beautifully as it's washed and run through the dryer. This is one that's used frequently. And since it's springtime, it's time to swap the quilts up at my house. So that's why this one is out. As far as lessons that I learned from this quilt, I will say that if I were doing it again, I would allow the batting in this quilt to extend a little longer to make sure that this binding was really nice and full. Or make the binding a little bit narrower, but I was trying to match these two stripes so that they would be similar. And this quilt has a solid white backing. You can see the design in the quilting. There you go. And it has the warm and white batting inside the quilt. It does tend to be a little bit lighter than some of the other quilts because it is generally one piece of material plus the little bit here for the plates. So it's a little bit lighter than some of the other designs where you've got lots of seams or you've got layer upon layer of fabric with a lot of applique work that's added to the top of it. So that's my Dresden Plate quilt. There were a lot of things that I learned in this process, how to handle a large quilt, because when you're used to smaller ones and you get a really big one, then you've got to make some decisions about how it's quilted and how you assemble it and how you manage that in a home environment. When I quilted this one, I did it on a Grace 3 frame. It's a hand quilting frame that allows you to assemble it without basting. So it was done without basting, and it was done on there completely and then taken off and finished at that point with the binding for the quilt. I think that's all that I wanted to share about this quilt at this time. It has given us a lot of pleasure. I really like the crinkled texture and look of this quilt. I think that to some degree, the little bit of fading that you see is reminiscent of a vintage quilt. And since this one is a little bit older, you would expect to see that. It's held up really well. I haven't noticed any loose stitches or any places where it's pulled the thread or the fabric. It really has held up well, and it just goes in a regular wash, a regular dryer. The only thing is I'm very careful in the beginning to use a color washer, and now to make sure that once it's washed and it's finished spinning that I get it out right away and get it right in the dryer and keep it adjusted as the drying time goes on so that the whole thing gets dried and not just a portion of it. This quilt will fit on a queen size bed with the roll over the pillows, but typically we don't use our quilts that way. We use our quilts more as a coverlet, and we have some other kind of pillow. So what I did with this one to coordinate with it is I had a kit from a store that had an embroidery pattern that they showed in the blue, and I thought it looked really good with this. So I did the embroidery pattern, and then I added a little tiny binding to the pillowcase that matched up with the quilt. So that allows it to have something that looks similar on the bed, and you're creating a design around that old-fashioned blue Dresden plate look. Thank you for joining us here at the Shamrock Quilt Studio. I hope you've enjoyed this tour of a Dresden plate quilt, and I hope that you will like our videos and subscribe to our channel so we can bring you many more videos in the future. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.